wrap up of the workshop now. We're going to have the people report back on their group breakout sessions. Maybe we could have a couple people type in if they're able to see this broadcast. I'll give it a few minutes and wait. Wrap up of the workshop now. We're going to have the people report back on their group breakout sessions. Maybe we could have a couple people type in if they're able to see this broadcast. I'll give it a few minutes and wait. All right, Chris German and a couple other people have said that they can see this live broadcast, so I'm going to have people start reporting back with Chris German. The people report back on their group breakout sessions. Maybe we could have a couple people type in if they're able to see this broadcast.
Okay, so the weird timing of this is kind of strange, but let's assume this is going to work fine. The geology group met. We had a couple of people who hadn't been in California participated in the meeting, and so we heard a little bit from them about their interests, which included the Petit spots, which are basically smaller versions of hotspot traces, so interesting geologic features off the coast of Chile is one of the target areas, so we got to hear some more in depth about that area and also about some of the interests in the California borderlands and the paleo sites there. The good news was that we actually found that the large-scale questions that we came up with in the geology discussions in the California workshop seemed to pretty much fit to everybody's interests in the room. We didn't actually identify any other major geologic questions we weren't dealing with. We had a question about whether or not one of the big questions that Nicole reported out on at the start of the meeting was on large impact structures, and we weren't sure if that was even getting addressed anywhere in the 33 target areas that are in the report right now. But then we heard that in fact the strongest candidate we know of is probably in the California borderlands, so it's actually somewhere that would get studied as part of the California borderland study. So I think the biggest thing we came up with was we were wondering whether or not there were actually good places to go for geologic transects between the boxes, so like to connect the dots between different places if the ship's making large transects across the Pacific Ocean. And so two ideas we came up with were one that we could be following seamount chains, and another one was to start following fracture zones across the Pacific. So we had this idea that there are these large fracture zones. We know they cross mid-ocean ridges, and we know sometimes they intersect trenches, and they've been studied from that ridge or trench perspective, but there hasn't been nearly as much study of what happens across the rest of the Pacific. And since they're one of the three major tectonic boundaries, it's kind of a compelling place that we should look at someday in the future. So we were kind of pleased that Lindsay joined our group and actually threw up the Google Maps of where the Okeanos Explorer is going this year, and it turned out we can actually probably save the ship a bit of gas money, that it has to make a transect to go to a particular site for NOAA PMEL before it heads north up to Hawaii to start doing some of its mapping objectives this year. And so we actually came up straight away with a really good example of where a long transect across the Pacific could actually be tailored a little bit, so that you can actually follow along one of these fracture zones. And so that seems like a good exemplar of the kind of thing we can do going forward into the future as well, that if a ship's heading from one side of the Pacific to another, it can actually take a slight detour for a little bit of effort and basically get a lot more scientific value. Okay, I'm done.
All right, Troy, I don't know if you're ready to give your update.
Yep, I'm ready. So I assume everyone can hear me okay, hopefully. I'm Dwight Coleman. I led the archaeology group, And there was only 3 of us in the group, actually. There was just myself and
Chris
Matthew.
German and a couple other people have said that they can see this live broadcast, so I'm going to have...
Sorry, I had to mute something there. I apologize. Russ Matthews was with me in the archaeology breakout group, as was Lynn from University of Southern California, USC. Lynn, I apologize, I didn't get your last name correct, so if you wouldn't mind typing your full name into the chat, that would be great, Lynn. So the 3 of us basically talked sort of in high-level, sort of broad discussions about the general archaeological sort of problems that we could try to address by exploring the Eastern Pacific. We spent a good deal of time focusing mostly around the Southern California area because, of course, that's where Lynn's interests are primarily. There's quite a bit of work that we could potentially do off of the Channel Islands and off of Catalina Island. So we'd love to do some exploration work focusing on the paleo landscape and paleo environment. And I'm glad to hear that Chris German mentioned it in the geology breakout group as well. And now this is basically looking at paleo landscapes that are submerged since the last glacial maximum by sea level rise. But these could unleash stories or evidence of the early peopling of the Americas, the early migration of people into the Americas from wherever they came from. So there's a lot of theories that they followed coastal routes, or they may even came by watercraft. And so looking around the Channel Islands is certainly of great interest. We could potentially find Paleo-Indian sites that are now in areas that are now submerged, but it is shallow water, relatively shallow water. So it's down to probably a water depth of about 92 meters, maybe a little deeper, and then anything more shallow than that. And we look to target areas along the shoreline, but also where there's submerged landscape features such as paleo river channels and areas that would have been habitable by early humans. And it's sort of a needle in a haystack, but there's sort of this broader context of trying to understand the submerged landscape. And we think that any mapping that we do in the area at those depths and any geological studies, certainly coring or side-scan sonar work or other geophysical investigations, subbottom profiling would give us some indication of what the landscape was and lead us to potential sites of human occupation. And so, and there's lots of evidence of early human activity, Paleo-Indian activity around the Channel Islands and around Catalina Island and around the Southern California area. So this would be a great outreach project too, in collaboration with some educational partners that we have at the Museum of Natural History in LA and potentially Octos in Santa Barbara. We could potentially do the work with folks in collaboration with the University of California, Santa Barbara, who have interest, and the U.S. Geological Survey, who has interest in the Southern California borderlands, looking at the tectonic environment, looking at the seismicity of the area, where the faults are, because right where these faults run offshore Southern California is the same area where these paleo shoreline features are found. In addition to looking at the paleo landscape, we talked about shipwreck activity, or the prospect to find shipwrecks in the marine environment here. Offshore San Diego, of course, being a naval base for a long period of time, would have wrecks associated with it. And then this Southern California area is one of the hot spots that we had identified in the earlier workshop as a potential hotspot of archaeological discovery. So we could potentially do a cruise to look at all this this interest in the Southern California borderlands area and off the Channel Islands, and potentially work with the NOAA Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, who have the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary as under their purview. So we'd work probably with Santa Barbara on that. Other than that, we talked sort of in larger context about other hotspots around the Pacific. Didn't really come up with anything new compared to what we've already identified in the Pacific workshop. Again, there was only 3 of us in the discussion. Russ Matthews has an interest in collaborating with us, looking at some shipwreck sites, certainly off American Samoa, and potentially off of Hawaii, Pearl Harbor area, also up and down the coast of South America, and other areas off California and Washington and Oregon and southern Canada. So that kind of summarizes our archaeological discussions and what our interests are, and so we can add a little bit to the database there. So thanks. Back to you, Nicole.
All right, thanks, Dwight. Catalina, you are the moderator for biology, right? Are you ready to report out?
Sure. Am I already up there? I only see Dwight.
Oh yeah, it'll catch up. Go ahead and start
Okay.
when you're ready.
Hi, everyone. So I did not capture the names of everyone who entered and exited our group. I don't know if there is some way to see that. I only wrote down the names of the folks who spoke up. So we had Amy Bako-Taylor and Karen Wishner in our group, and they were talking about oxygen minimum zones and how there's some really unique areas in the eastern tropical Pacific where these gradients in the water column would affect benthic and pelagic organism distributions along the continental shelf and seamounts and other areas. So they crafted a pre-question 6 for the biology group. So what are the natural environmental gradients, and how does the distribution of organisms vary with those gradients? Sort of a precursor to question 6, which talked about how these natural gradients would then inform organism and ecosystem adaptation to global change. So that's kind of a good addition to our questions that they came up with. Amy was also interested in potentially creating a different transect. We have this red zigzag transect around New Zealand, and I don't recall how that was crafted, but folks were interested in understanding how that was put together. I assume that might be in the notes somewhere. But she thought an area that included Empress Seamount in a transect would have a lot of interest for folks. Amy also mentioned areas south and west of Hawaii that are right now outside of the orange boxes that we've crafted. That's mostly unexplored, but there's a lot of potential for mining manganese in that area, so it might be important to gain a baseline of information before something like that happens. As she said, right currently there's no data out there. And there are manganese crusts on seamounts in that area that they do know. And then we had Andrea Polanco from Colombia, and she has a white paper in about the biodiversity in the distribution of the deep sea around Colombia down to 4,000 meters. And she noted that the boxes that we've crafted so far do not include that deeper area, so she'd like to see them extend out to 4,000 meters, so I made note of that. And I might pronounce this name incorrect, but Hiroki Katayama from Japan was on, and he's a videographer and a movie maker. And he said that he has a 1,200 meter depth camera for light sensitivity work, potentially to do water column bioluminescent work. If anyone's interested in borrowing the camera, he said that he could arrange that. So he apparently does bioluminescent work, so the camera was designed specifically for that. And Ruth Blake talked to us about her interest in the water column and making sure that we have a focus on the micro as well as the macro, so I made note of that. And that's it. So back to you.
Thanks, Catalina.
Sure.
Brian Kennedy was having some technical difficulties for doing his report out on physical and chemical oceanography, but he mentioned in the chat that really the big takeaway there was looking at how the physical oceanography processes are coupled with microbial communities, so that certainly ties into some of the biological reports that Catalina mentioned. So I think next we will bring Derek into the chat to report out on the Eastern Pacific region. It's the last report out for this on Hangout session.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So my report out should be pretty short. We had a very pretty small group for most of the time, about five of us. Got up to about 8 people at the end there. But we had some interesting feedback from people that are more of, I guess you could say, end users of exploration data and video. And so we got some input on how the data that comes out of exploration trips might actually get used in terms of either outreach opportunities via the telepresence model.
The names of the folks who spoke up. So
Sorry, I'm
we
getting
have
some
Amy
feedback.
Baker-Taylor and Karen Lichtenau in our group, and they were talking
I'm just going
about
to turn off something here.
minimum zones and how there's... Somehow I'm hearing myself over again.
Yeah, I am too.
Something's wrong. Yeah, we're all hearing my talk over again for some reason.
You guys need to mute your player in the lobby. Mute the YouTube player in the lobby.
Okay. Thanks. So, of one thing that was very interesting that came out of our discussion was that there's been quite a bit of work going on off of the countries of South America, looking at sort of coordination among governments there, and on the EEZ, looking at the Convention of Biological Diversity. We had Jesse Cleary on from Duke giving us an update on some of the marine spatial planning work going on in that region. And an interesting point there was that exploration of those areas would actually provide a really nice outreach opportunity to let people know what is out there that they're not currently aware of, and put sort of the benthic habitat and more of a deep sea habitat understanding into a lot of the mindsets of the managers and decision makers in that region of the world. And we actually looked at some of the maps, the draft maps that Jesse was sharing with us that were coming out of these discussions on the Convention of Biological Diversity, and they had very nice alignment with areas that were identified through the planning workshop for the Ocean Exploration Trust. So it's kind of a good cross-validation of geographic areas that were identified as high priority. We had Edgardo Londano Cruz on the phone. He was with us at the workshop, and essentially validating that the draft that's out there right now does reflect pretty well what input he had at the workshop, as well as some of his colleagues. So I guess in essence, we found that the draft maps and plan were actually a good reflection. We didn't have anything substantial to edit or add that was really new. We did have some discussion about why Sally E. Gomez area in particular was a high priority. So we got some good links to references on that. That other groups, especially nonprofits, are looking at some sort of conservation initiatives in that area. So exploring that area would inform those efforts. Also, while we're out doing exploration work, if we can collect data on that's useful for populating the global biogeographic databases, that's going to be useful with a larger scale understanding of biodiversity patterns. So to the extent we contribute to that through individual missions, that will help support the robustness of those databases. We also talked with the filmmaker Hiroki about his work, and he's definitely interested in collaboration, so there might be some opportunities there for our programs to look at filmmaking or exploring the use of even higher resolution video in the future. And then we had some discussion about some of the priority areas down off of Colombia. They're recognized in that region. There's a sort of a corridor of areas called the Tropical Eastern Pacific Corridor. It's a very pretty substantial large box, so that's reflected as a priority within our sort of large box in the report. But we talked about whether the small boxes that we have as priorities adequately sort of represent that corridor. And I think we do, but it might be good to highlight that within those small regional priority boxes, they are part of this sort of larger area that's recognized as the Tropical Eastern Pacific Corridor. So just highlighting that in the report a little bit more clearly with some feedback we got. Let's see. We talked a little bit about the Carnegie and Cocos ridges as part of that corridor area. And then we talked about whether there are representative seamounts within those areas, specifically to look at some of the questions that have been mentioned earlier about sort of the oxygen and depth gradients along seamounts, and making sure that we had areas where we can be able to understand the biology's response to changes in those gradients, such as OMZ zones. And of particular note is that some of those have long time series from 20 or 30 years ago, so we could actually begin to understand if there's expansion or contraction of the OMZs. And then recognizing those seamounts as stepping stones. So I guess the take-home message is that what we have in the draft there is a good representation for that region of the Pacific. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Derek. We didn't have groups that convened about the North Pacific or the South and Central Pacific, so if anyone has additional comments they'd like to make, please do so directly on the report. And now I'll turn it over to Katie for the wrap-up.
Great, thank you, Nicole, and a big thanks to all of you for joining us today. The Unhangout platform is new to us. This is the first time we've used it, and probably the first time many of you have used it. So we'd appreciate your feedback on that. I'd also like to thank Griff Peterson, Philip Schmidt, and Srishti Sethi from the MIT Media Lab, who have been working on developing this platform and helped us to make this event happen. So I'm going to wrap up very quickly with one slide, and I'm going to have to remember to share my screen. So we're loading right now. And these are a few of the next steps that we're going to be taking over the next month or two. Initially, we will certainly incorporate today's discussion into the report. All of the comments that facilitators have provided to us just now in this short wrap-up, as well as any comments that have been put into the chat. The report online as the Google Doc will also be open for comment until the end of next week, so please, if you have any additional thoughts, definitely include them there. A lot of people, as I mentioned previously, have already done that, and we really appreciate that feedback because we know there are a lot of gaps and we want to fill them. And then we will work on the final report, which will be available on the Ocean Exploration Trust website by the end of the month. And there will also be a summary of the final report in our supplement to the March issue of Oceanography magazine. So if you get Oceanography, you'll be getting a hard copy of that. If you don't, we will send out a link so you can download it. Following that, opportunities for participation in the 2015 Nautilus and Okeanos cruises we'll send out via email. There will be opportunities to participate from shore, definitely in Nautilus, and I'm sure the Okeanos team will be able to give you more feedback on opportunities there. And finally, the Unhangout team would like to send around a survey on your experience. So we'd love to give your feedback on this as a platform and how you thought it went. If you have any suggestions for improvement, to see if we can use it again for another platform for sharing ideas and thoughts on exploration. So we'd like to thank you so much for coming and being a part of this. Special thank you also to our organizing group from both the Trust, Nicole in particular, as well as the Ocean Exploration and Research Office at NOAA for your assistance in making this all happen. We'll stay on for a few minutes in the chat, so if you have any additional thoughts, comments, questions, please write that in, and we will definitely see you out on the water soon.